Hi, everybody. Jen and I are back today on the Unfiltered Family Therapist podcast. And today we're talking about a really cool topic, Alex Honnold and the research that was done on his brain. For people that don't know, Alex Honnold is a world-renowned rock climber. And I'll let Jen kind of summarize the brain research that she read about and introduced that topic to me. So it's been fascinating learning about him.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. It's been a couple of weeks since we've met. For all of you out there being affected by the California fires, if go get help if you need. There's like free resources out there. There's people out there that are willing to help you. I know it's very tragic for all of those out there experiencing the smoke damage, the fire damage, just all of that. So if you need help, there's no shame in asking for help. So welcome back.
Absolutely.
We haven't really met since before the holiday, so welcome back, everybody. So I have been fascinated with Alex Honnold. I've been following his career, and then when he did the free solo climb of Yosemite of Half Dome back in 2000, I think it was 17, they did a documentary on him from National Geographic, I believe, and it went through his whole journey of climbing unassisted, which is unheard of because that's a like sheer like rock. And it talked about his relationships. It talked about, his family from growing up. And one of the things that they found with Alex Honnold was the part of his brain, the amygdala. It's the amygdala, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the amygdala wasn't firing, and that whole sense of fear, he doesn't experience that. So this guy really doesn't have a lot of fear-based reactions. And in his documentary, you hear him saying, well, it's a good day to die. And he's got a girlfriend on that. They're now since married, have kids. And they did some research and they were found out that his dad most likely had autism. He was very focused on one thing, and that was traveling. He wasn't very socially nice, I guess. Like the mom was talking about how dad would be like, "Oh, you idiot, you dummy," and it's funny because with him and his amygdala not firing and also being autistic, you see some of the struggles that him and his girlfriend have.
Yeah.
They're going to
And
look at a house. Oh, go ahead.
just to explain real quick what the amygdala is the part of the brain that historically, um, you know, the message was that that's the fear center in the brain, but really it's a way to think of it as the survival notification center of the brain because
Yes.
it notifies you of anything that will ensure your survival, including positive things like food or sex. Sex being it helps ensure the survival of our species. So
Yes.
it sends this signal to your body. If you are afraid, it produces adrenaline and cortisol and puts your body in that fight, flight, freeze response that people experience. And the research showed that he didn't have much activation, that it didn't create that response in his body.
Right. You're right. It's designed to keep us alive,
Yeah.
and most people have that fear of things that are scary that,
Falling off the
most
rock,
falling
mountain.
off the rock, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
2,000 feet off of a sheer face rock.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, with that, it shows, his complications in having a relationship with somebody who's neurotypical
Mhm.
and, being neurodivergent. There's a scene in his documentary where they went to go look for an apartment, and then all of a sudden it flash forward, they're in their van again, and she's talking about how he wasn't so nice and he called her dummy. And I was looking at how a lot of the family relational things were passed down from his dad.
Yeah.
So, the fact that, he has that lack of firing in the amygdala, and he also is neurodivergent with, possibly being on the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The research is showing that autism is highly heritable. And if you have one child with autism, you're more likely to have another child with autism, which is, part of what they think is contributing to the increased diagnosis of autism. So, his dad has autism spectrum or, is on the spectrum somehow. There's autism and then there's autism spectrum. Um, but whether it's learned and activates some genetics in Alex, regardless, he does demonstrate similar behaviors and this lack of ability to connect. But the cool thing I loved watching in Free Solo was the patience that his wife presented. And, in the other shows, there's a couple other shows that I watched that show him and his wife together, and her patience with him and the frustration that he brings to her life too. But her things that she wants to do also bring frustration to his life because
Yeah, because he
it's
kept
about their
saying things
perceptions.
like, I don't know if I can be in this relationship because I've fallen more than I've ever had now being in this relationship.
Yeah.
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 So he was really second guessing that. And, she kept asking him things like, what do you need to be able to like not do things so dangerously? Like she
Hmm.
was trying to like question to see, what was his motivation? What would stop him from trying to be so living on the edge?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm so curious because I read the articles about his research, the research on his brain, and they say, he doesn't, his brain didn't, his amygdala didn't activate the way the control subject brain activated by watching certain pictures that would activate that fight, flight, freeze response. But I'd be curious to see, if he were to watch his, maybe a movie of his wife complaining about what he was doing, if he would in that experience have activation, because so much of what activates our amygdala, there's the survival states. If a bear is chasing you, pretty much everyone's brain is likely to be active because it's a survival issue. But human beings create a lot of their own fight, flight, freeze responses based in how they think, how they perceive experiences. So I'd be curious to see what his amygdala does if his wife is saying, I really don't want you to go rock climbing today, if he
Right.
would have the activation then, because the
Yeah.
perception would probably be different.
Have you watched the new documentary where they're going to Greenland and they're trying to
Yes.
traverse? Yeah. So, the only time I saw him show fear was when he was on Polar Bear Watch. And he's like, so apparently we have polar bears. And you see him kind of look over his shoulder.
Yeah.
And that's the first time in all of his interviews, all the things that I've seen of him, that he actually showed a little bit of, oh my gosh, there's something I have to worry about.
Right. Yeah. But
Yeah.
I think the cool thing about this, we talked before about memory reconsolidation and how you can condition your body to respond differently by, as I described, taking an avoid state and moving it mentally into an approach state is really rewiring your brain, but teaching your body how to respond in a different way. Um, and I think by controlling your awareness of how you're responding, learning how to down regulate your brain, your body from responding. And you can see that in Free Solo, the amount of time that he trains his body to
Yes.
respond, hanging by his fingers forever, and the mental uh awareness that he would have to focus on to just manage the discomfort that would come from just starting to hang from your fingers. And then eventually his body's conditioned, the muscles change, the neural networks in his brain change, and then he just hangs there forever. And
Yeah.
could probably hold a whole conversation, but maybe it would interfere with his concentration. I don't know.
He wouldn't even be out of breath.
Yeah, so it was fascinating to watch, and all the ways my brain is like, but what about this? What about this? So I really
Yeah.
liked it. Yeah.
Well, and the reason that I'm so drawn towards like the research on him is because, like we said, we all have that fear, right? Of like not surviving what we're going to do. That
Hmm.
amygdala, throws us those cues of be careful, you're going to die. Ah, it's very dangerous. So most people are programmed to like, survive, perpetuate the
Hmm.
species. And it's
Right.
almost like, his attitude is like, it is what it is, what it is what it is. And if I die, I
Hmm.
die. You know, and
Yeah.
in Free Solo, you see him. He lost a friend while he was filming. One of his rock climbing friends died doing a difficult climb, and he talks about it non emotionally, just like, well, he died doing what he loved. Pretty
Hmm.
much sums it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm fascinated by people who don't have that barrier, that just like you're allowed to go out and do the most amazing free, like
Hmm.
free will, free strong, all the shit that they do without any fear of dying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because human beings have this highly developed cortex that attaches meaning and reason and belief to their experiences, you know, as we don't necessarily know if animal brains attach meaning and reason and belief, but they we suspect by their behavior that they don't, because you think a deer gets chased by a bear, it gets away from the bear, it just goes back to eating. A human being gets chased by a bear, gets away from the bear. They might not eat for days and just be thinking, what was I doing in that field? And what do I do to prevent that from
And I'm
happening
never going
again?
into that field again.
Right, yes. And
Yes.
or the other one that reminds them of that field. And so human beings, we have this highly developed creative cortex, but we also create our own fear situations. So you're
Yes.
sitting there thinking about having been chased by a bear, but that moment doesn't exist anywhere in space or time.
You're right.
So we create, there's I always say the benefit of fight, flight, freeze is when there's an actual threat. But when there's a perceived threat, there's no value in having that fight, flight, freeze response. However, um, that the discomfort, you can think of fight, flight, freeze as, deadly and not deadly, but it's really on a spectrum as well. Dis
Mm-hmm.
You smell something and your brain goes, what is that? Well, oh, it's the trash, right? The smell of the trash probably isn't going to kill you, but the purpose of that response is to, if there's, Agent Orange, yeah, get away from it. Something
Right.
deadly. That's the value of that response. So there is that spectrum between deadly versus perception, and actual versus perceived, and recognizing a perceived threat and down regulating your body to stay present with I'm safe. It can absolutely help enhance your ability to accomplish things that you want to accomplish, do things that you might avoid. Um, but it does take that whether awareness, we can call it a lot of different things: consciousness, awareness, attention to, or sometimes it's just behave differently. Where, let's
Right.
say, for instance, Alex is just deciding I need to start hanging, from my fingers for a long period of time. Was that a mental process beforehand, or was it a decision that he was going to make to train his body? And by training his body, he trained his mind, right? What
Mm,
comes first, the chicken or the egg?
right.
So the learning how to work with your brain, instead of against it, is really so important for rapid change, effective change. But the way we talk about our brains in society isn't even accurate. There's a lot of meaning and reason and belief behind it. Doesn't mean there's accuracy to it.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
And yeah,
one of the things, okay.
and just to add real quick, when um when Alex uh, when his mom was talking about Alex's dad and how his dad behaved towards him, Alex said, I don't even remember that. Right. So what his mom might have perceived as problematic, Alex is like, didn't even notice.
Right. But then you
Perception.
flash forward, right? And the way he was talking to Sani, his girlfriend, in the RV, well, during when they were
Yeah.
trying to buy that house, was
Right.
almost like what his mom described, how his
Yeah.
dad would talk to him.
Yeah.
So he may not have remembered, but we're looking at the effect
Conditioning.
conditioning. Yes.
Yep. Yeah. We're
Yes.
not always aware of the ways that we've been conditioned through our experiences. So we don't
Yeah.
always have an emotional response, but the way his mom perceived it was different than how he perceived it. But eh, when we give birth to a human, we're giving birth to a human that is is not like any other human on the planet. It's not even possible. And our experiences determine the perceptions that we have in future situations. So people are different, and what works for one doesn't always work for another. So respect for individuality is also
Oh yeah.
important,
Yep.
because his mom might have just, hounded him about how horrible his dad was. His dad had died, I think, at 14 or 17 or something like that. Um, but let's say she just hounded him about it. Well, just that conditioning could make him hate his dad. I didn't hear that
Right.
in the story, but you can be conditioned by somebody else's
Yes.
perception of a situation, which is why I
Exactly.
love marriage and family therapy, because it helps separate individuals.
Yep. My son is highly functioning on the spectrum, and I ask him on a daily basis, I'm like, am I caring about this more than you are? And he'll often tell me, yeah. He's like, that's not in my wheelhouse. I don't care. So, I have to
Very
like
cool.
check in with him on a, weekly, daily basis to see, what do I need to worry about? Where is your head? I'm
Yeah.
trying to meet him where he's at,
Yeah.
you
And very
know?
cool that you would ask that question, because sometimes parents think because I'm the parent that I know better, instead
Right.
of, they know themselves better than you know them. And it's
Right.
never possible that just because they're your kid that you're going to know them better than they know
Yeah.
themselves.
Well, and his dad's big about he needs to go out and socialize. He needs to do this. And I'll ask him, I said, is that important to you? He's like, no, I've got friends at school. I'm cool. So,
Yeah.
our desire, what we think is healthy, isn't necessarily what
Mhm.
somebody else wants for themselves.
Yeah. And imagine, if you're pushing that same thing, you need to do this, you need to do this. Well, sometimes that your kid can start to pathologize themselves. So what's wrong with me that I don't think that way?
Yeah.
Instead of just being okay being himself.
Right. And I've had to have conversations, with him and his dad, like, to his dad, I'm like, you're very neurotypical. Me and him are very neurodivergent.
Hmm.
So your expectations, you know, I always say I'm hard to kidnap because I am just so like nothing makes sense
Oh,
with me.
God, yes, you are.
Nothing
We
makes sense.
always we always joke, Jen is a shit stir. Like it's unpredictable. You're not going to see it coming. It's funny as hell, but they're going to
Right.
let you out of the van for sure.
Right. And I tell my son that I'm like, we think differently, we feel differently, we process the world differently. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with us. It just means that
Mhm.
people who are neurotypical don't know how to relate to us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And
But
I tell him all the time, I'm like, there's nothing wrong with you. Your brain just operates differently.
yeah,
Yeah.
the thing, I actually went to a training on, testing for autism and ADHD yesterday. And, you know, the, the, the cool thing about it is, you know, it, spectrum is vast, right? And
Yes.
um, I actually think, there's research that says that the value of autism and ADHD, they're closely related. But like ADHD, they're more able to pick up on patterns. So, for instance, the study that they did is they had people with ADHD pick berries on a computer program, and what they found was that neurotypical people would focus on cleaning the whole bush, getting all the berries off of the bush, where people with ADHD are able to pick up on patterns, more able to see clusters of berries, and would actually get more berries because they didn't just finish that project. They went to what was easiest. But in society, me being ADHD and, middle of the road spectrum as well, I got in trouble for shortcuts when I was a
Me
kid.
too. Yes.
Yeah.
I always
And
thought I'm going to work smarter, not harder.
yep, absolutely. So I got criticized for that as a kid, but as I got older and started to accept myself the way I was way more efficient in how I would do things, whether in comparison to my previous responses to situations or in comparison to other neurotypical people. So there's value in it, and they actually think um, the theories are that some of the value of ADHD is it's an evolution of humans to ensure survival in that way, that we need more of that ability um, to see things in a different way. And I think that in my mind, my own theory, I don't, there's not been any research about it, but what you see with people with autism is they're often more logical. They might have big emotional outbursts, but the way they think is very much outside the box and often very logical thinking. But I think the value in that as a therapist is the majority of my clients have these big emotions and these big um, uh, beliefs and meanings and reasons. And, with, neurodivergent individuals, you have less of that. And I think because that's so big in our society, to think of things in this overwhelming, meaningful direction, I think the increase in autism could also be related to an evolution of we need to be more logical, get back closer to our animal brain, like the deer, where
Yes.
we recognize, you know, those the ability to reactivate a memory and respond to it and go into tears about a memory that happened when we were 5 that doesn't exist anywhere in space or time actually keeps us from being efficient in what we're doing today, because
Right.
that memory only exists in the wiring in our brain. It doesn't exist in space or time. So our body's taking action around events that are not happening.
Well,
So
you got to
I think
think
of it
about
that way.
too. Yeah, the people with big emotions, right? When you have big emotions, what happens? You get stuck in fight, flight, or freeze. And what's the
Yep.
first thing that goes offline? Our left side of our brain, which is
Yep.
reasoning, processing, finding communication, the ability to
Yep.
move. So the
Yep.
people that don't have that, who are neuro like divergent, will end up being the ones that will be like, okay, well, if this world is ending and we're going to have an avalanche and that thing's going to cave in, we need to move.
Yeah.
Whereas people who are like neurotypical might be panicking and be like, oh no,
Mhm.
look, there's a flood coming.
Yeah.
The neurodivergent people who are logical are like, let's go, let's move.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And when people have trauma is very much those memories that reactivate our body's fight, flight, freeze response. Um, especially when we have a lot of trauma, our body starts to dissociate from the feelings in our body that tell us, you know, to take some action. So then they're in this fight, flight, freeze response and don't even recognize there's been a sensation that told you to take an action. But when you reactivate that sensation and do something different, then your brain can learn, oh, there's no bear.
Mm-hmm.
So one of
Yep.
the things that I do with my clients when we start turning that feeling state back on, that is their recognition, oh, I'm going into fight, flight, freeze. And then once they have that awareness of the feeling, and then we do this silly thing where we like check for bears. Oh, there's no bears. And you do it in this silly way where you're not judging yourself, you're not saying I'm stupid or broken, because anxiety is the survival mechanism. We all have it. We're all
Yeah.
animals, primates. And so there's value in it, but moving ourselves back to our primate brain where it's only responding to things that are happening is a way that you can actually treat trauma very quickly by having that behavioral response that is associated with that memory, and it teaches your body, I don't need that anymore. Just like the sandal story last week, or
Right.
when we talked last.
Yeah. Well, I know I brought this up before, but back in 2018, when I was living in Hawaii, we had it was like 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, and we got a text coming in saying incoming ballistic missile alert. And it was like, take cover 15 minutes. And I'm like,
Oh,
oh
yeah, I
shit.
remember that.
Yeah. So it's Saturday morning. My kids come in running because they have cell phones and they got the message like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And they were literally freaking out. And they're like, should we hide in the closet? I'm like, our house is made of wood. We're going to be obliterated. I didn't want to say that.
Right.
And I said, you know what? Just climb in bed, grab the Uno cards, climb in bed. This is how we're going to go all together.
Mhm.
And at that point, I realized life is short. Like,
Mhm.
all the things that I was afraid of doing or like hesitant, I'm like, you know what? From this point forward, life is so short. I had a near death
Mhm.
experience. I'm
Mhm.
like, I thought, well, this is the way it's going to end. I'm going to be blown
Yeah.
up by a missile. And we didn't know for like
Yeah.
45 minutes. The state totally dropped the ball
Yeah.
and
Yeah. It was
didn't
a
tell us
mistake.
anything for 45 minutes. So we were all thinking we were going to die. And
Yeah.
I was just ready to say, okay, this is just the way it ends.
Yeah.
So ever since that point, I'm at this thing like, well, life is too short. I want to be able to do everything I possibly can in
Mhm.
order to like say when I died, I've done everything.
Yeah.
So my fear, my apprehension, all that disappeared that day.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
very cool that you say that because, I think of, my near death experience was completely meaning created, and it was created by my own experience as a kid where I would have done anything to not go through a divorce. I never wanted my kids to go through what I did. I had a really shitty stepmom and, lots of conflicts between my parents. So I never wanted that for my kids. So even when, I found out my ex had cheated on me multiple times, I was like, okay, we're going to stay. I don't want my kids to go through that. So I stayed and, had two more kids and, it happened again, but I had agreed when I learned about the first times that if it happens again, I'm leaving. So when I did leave, and the amount of anxiety that that belief caused for me was, the kids' shoes have to match their shirts and, like
Yeah.
anything to look like it was supposed to look. But once I made that decision, I remember when I was married the first time, I couldn't sleep at night. I'd be up until 2, 3 in the morning and just insomnia. But the day that he left, I was awake all night. The kids were all in bed crying with me. And the next night, I slept like a fucking baby.
Wow.
And I have been sleeping like a baby ever since. It was so good for me to do something that my everything in my being was avoiding. To me it was like a near death experience, and my brain was like, I'm going to do life a different way. And I absolutely have, and met my husband now. He's fucking amazing. So yeah, it was good for me, even though that was a traumatic experience. And, I can still hear my kids crying. Now they're all adults and they're really grateful for the decision I made. It was good for them. It was good for us and our family. And, they still have a relationship with their dad, but sometimes those avoid states are actually really healthy for us to
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah. Well, what did you experience in your life, right? Divorce was ugly. It was messy.
Yep.
It was awful for the children.
Yeah.
And I agree with
Yeah.
that because I remember watching my parents divorced and oh, it was messy. My mom and my dad just would go at it. He had gotten someone else pregnant and then married her. My mom totally unraveled, became even crazier than she already was. And I had two shitty parents, but I ended up with a wonderful stepmother.
Yeah.
And, she divorced my
I have one
dad,
too.
stayed in my life. Her boyfriend, they were together like I think 20 some years before she passed away. He was wonderful to me too. So I have been telling all kids, because I'm a registered play therapist, I was telling all kids, I'm like, divorce isn't as bad as you think it is. Divorce is
Yeah.
really, up to your parents deciding how they want to put their ego aside, but there's worse things than divorce.
Yeah.
What's the worst thing is
Absolutely.
two people staying together who are hurting each other.
Yeah.
But so much of our, childhood memories, right, affect our, adult like brains and how we like decide what decisions we're going to make. We
Absolutely.
have all those, neural pathways, before the age of 7,
Yep.
in such a small amount of time. And we spend the rest of our lives trying to get over that,
Yeah.
trying to overcome the messages. And those messages are based on other people's traumas, our
Yeah.
parents' traumas. And
Yeah.
here we are now, generations past, and we're still carrying those messages.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and when I work with families, I often say, adults tend to do fine in divorce. How kids do is usually determined by the parents.
Yes.
And so if they can't manage their own shit, it becomes the kid's shit.
Right.
And it's throwing monkey shit like you talked about before,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And so I always try to work with parents to be good co-parents, but it really comes down to their ability to emotionally regulate
Yeah. Can
and
you put
really
your
put
ego
their kids.
aside? Can you put that hurt aside?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And manage their own trauma. When I
Right.
went through it, I was not perfect. There was definitely times when, I'm like, your dad's a piece of shit. I really tried not to do that very often. And I think I didn't do it very often, but it really only takes one time for your kid to be like, oh, well, that's how mom feels about it now. So many different ways that can show up. A kid may be like, oh, I can't be close to dad because mom doesn't like him and I really like mom. Or
Yep.
they may disconnect from me because I don't like him and I like dad better. Or they
Yep.
just disconnect from both because there's conflict between them. And but them their identity is so connected to their parents. If their parents are always fighting about them, then they think I must have caused it, right? It's me that's
Exactly.
causing it.
We never look at our
So
parents and think, what's wrong with them? We look at ourselves and think, what's wrong with
yep.
us?
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that's that animal brain too, where, or the human brain too, where we turn that lens on ourselves. Am I good? Am I bad? That's conditioned in how we
Yeah.
interact in
Well, that
childhood.
narcissistic sense of self, right? That not narcissism in general, right? But that feeling of being narcissistic, worrying about yourself, thinking everything revolves around you. It's a survival skill. We
Yeah.
had to be super in tune with other people's stuff in order to
Yeah.
survive and
That social
evolve.
brain. But
Yeah.
I think too, and this is why I love family therapy separate from, other mental health treatments, because it accounts for the conditioning that we grow up with. Maybe I've said before, I don't remember, but if you tell your kid, your grades are bad, clean them up, your room is a disaster, pick it up, I don't like your attitude, straighten up. What an adult is saying is, I have a problem, it's your job to fix it, you're the problem, instead of it's actually the parent's perception of the problem that's causing the problem for the kid, but the kid internalizes it.
Mm-hmm.
And that consistent message, not because a parent is trying to screw up a kid, but because kids create chaos because they don't know shit about how the world works.
Right.
So there's that conditioning that keeps us always turning the lens on ourselves. What am I do? Why am I, what am I doing? Why am I bad? Instead of, when you move into adulthood and your partner says, can you help me with the dishes? And you go, I just did them. You're not
Yep.
helping understand, the dish situation. You're automatically defending yourself because most of
Right.
us have been conditioned like that in childhood instead
All
of
right.
what would you like to be different? Because a complaint is about the complainer. So you want to understand
Yep.
the complaint. Kids aren't often allowed to ask questions to understand, why is this important? I'm going to
Right.
show you why it's important. Just get your ass in there and get it done.
Right.
And so again, we're conditioned not to understand a problem before we try to solve it. We get
And then we're also
conditioned to just
conditioned
make
not to
people
ask
comfortable.
questions either,
Yeah,
to keep your mouth shut and
absolutely.
be a
Our
people
job is to
pleaser.
make other people comfortable, and
Yeah.
that doesn't help us be good for ourselves.
Yeah. And when I'm doing, family therapy, I'm always telling the parents, I'm like, we're fighting against generational patterns of parenting that have been in
Yes.
place for how many generations in your family. And I'm
Yeah.
asking you to be able to change the way that you talk to your child, the way you talk to yourself, the way that, you use your tone of voice, all those things,
Yeah.
because we're raising little human beings.
Yeah.
Children aren't something to be, not seen and not heard, right?
Yeah.
They're little things that are trying to figure out their world and their place in the world.
Yeah. Well, and that's why that intergenerational trauma understanding is so important, because you can say, don't talk to your kid that way, but they're talking to that kid that way because that's how they were talked to. So you really
Mm-hmm.
have to come back and help them address their own emotional responses when, they had an experience and their parents like, just shut up and do it. And you ask them how they felt about it. That creates that feeling that, remember that feeling and now imagine your kid feeling that way.
Yeah.
That emotional connection, empathizing is how you help them see their kid differently because they see
Mm-hmm.
themselves differently, right? It's
Yes.
reparenting themselves
Yep.
that they
You
can do
have to
it.
explore what was shut down in them because they're going to shut down in their kids
Yeah.
what was shut down in them because no one ever taught them how to deal with those things.
Yeah, it's mindless. Parents don't try to fuck up their kids.
Right.
They're conditioned from their own experiences
I
and
mean,
don't recognize that emotional drive to just
yeah.
react. So
Well,
you
if
have
you
to
were
connect
shut
that
down
emotion.
a lot as a child, you weren't allowed to have a voice, a say, an option. What happens is we just go on autopilot, right? So we just go
Yep.
into it and we have those phrases,
Just
don't
get
make
shit done.
me under this
Yeah.
house,
I'm
under
gonna
this
pull
roof,
over.
all this. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And it's
Yep.
like those things just, we do it so automatically because it was told to us over and
Yeah.
over. And it just kind of took our will away, our soul.
Yeah. And it's
Pop it on our little
mindless.
soul. Yep.
Yeah. Parents don't intend to fuck up their kid, but there's no kid that gets out of childhood without baggage.
Right.
It's just, as a kid that becomes an adult and you learn to be more aware of ways that you were emotionally hijacked, process that emotional response. Because remember, our emotions are driven off of our amygdala saying good, bad, right? Approach,
Right.
avoid. So
Yep.
that's our barrier. When our brain goes, nope, that's bad, we just react. It may not be bad.
Right.
A divorce may not be bad. And me having that awareness personally allows me to be a better therapist because sometimes as a therapist, you see these people so afraid of getting divorced. We're going to stay together because of the kids, but they might be better for their kids by being
Yeah.
divorced.
Yeah.
And, can you both just love your kids and end your relationship? Because it might be healthier for everybody involved
Yep.
where you don't have to fight
Mhm.
over them. You get to allow them to have a relationship with both of you independently.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times that, you may have a sucky partner, but that partner is oftentimes a really good parent to
Hmm.
their children, but it's
Yeah.
hard to separate that.
Yeah.
A lot of our
I
stuff is abandonment, based and, attachment based. And
yeah.
when we're like not getting our needs met, it's really hard to see the forest for the trees and be like, well, you suck to me, but you're great to them.
Yeah. I use the metaphor of spices. When you make a cake, you put, these certain ingredients in there. And, if you dump a bunch of, you might like pepper on your steak or, on your food. And that's a good ingredient. But if you dump a bunch of pepper in your cake, it doesn't make it bad. It just bad in that mixture, right? So
Right.
it's thinking of you as recipes. It doesn't make either ingredient bad. It's just not good in this recipe.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you ever watch Friends when Rachel was trying to make the cake and she made a trifle with meat because she got the pages stuck together in her recipe book and
Oh
everyone's
no.
trying to eat it and everyone's like, oh, and Joey's like, oh, meat and dessert are the same thing. It's great.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's, yeah.
Perception.
Yeah, exactly. It's perception, right? What do you like? What can you
Yeah.
tolerate? What is your preference?
That's funny. No,
Yeah.
I've never watched I've seen plenty of Friends episodes, but I've never watched the whole thing. And my youngest daughter would shame me for that because I think she's seen the whole series probably 4 or 5 times. She'll just
I
clean
love it.
house, watch
All my
it.
young clients come in, they're like, I found the series on Netflix. It's called Friends. Have you seen
Friends.
it? I'm like, oh my God, every Thursday I used to watch that.
Yeah, that's funny.
And we had to wait till the next week to figure out what's
Yeah.
going to happen.
Yeah. See
Yeah.
perception. I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
need it. I was more
Yeah.
nerdy than that. Now I'll watch it, but only I
Yeah.
watch whatever Lonnie watches. He's the remote control holder.
Yeah. My friend's daughter came and she's like, I found this show called Felicity. I'm like, oh my God, I loved Felicity.
Never seen
Never
it.
saw it. Oh, it was
Mm-mm.
girl went off to college. She like chose a college because of the boy she liked and then met another boy. And it doesn't really hold well into this like age because, it's not, we're not empowering women by choosing to go to
Mhm.
college. with a boy.
Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
I was
But
actually into reality shows and ER, medical
oh,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, that was my
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
But
circling back to Alex Honnold, right, and his brain, the amygdala. Let's talk a little bit about the amygdala. In your research, what have you found with people who have lack of firing in the amygdala?
actually there's really Alex Honnold is one of the biggest stories that I've read about it because everybody, essentially, most people have an amygdala and it activates for multiple survival reasons. And, you know, just watching that, the end of it, I could feel, people say like my taint crinkled, or make my butthole pucker. I I was like, ooh, that's tough to watch. And as you read these articles about it, most of the people that were doing the research, they're like, I couldn't even watch it.
Yeah,
And so there's so little research about there's few cases of
yeah.
situations like that.
I would
So
love to have some more research on like the people who are opposite of him that are afraid of everything. Let's do some research on their
yeah,
amygdala, and more of the people who are like him. Let's do some more MRIs and
yeah,
see what we're finding, and could it, I always like to look at environment too. If he had a dad that was emotionally disconnected,
yeah,
what happens as children? Do we learn to be emotionally disconnected?
yeah.
Oftentimes, yes. You
Well,
know?
and as an applied neuroscience researcher, I'm always looking at research with human subjects. And that so much about that is controlled by IRBs, institutional review boards for research, to protect individuals because there's been a lot of shitty research
Oh,
on
yes.
people.
And
Um,
MRIs are very
this,
expensive too.
absolutely, yeah, the cost of it. So,
Yeah.
you know, lots that is prohibitive in doing that. But I I love that kind of research where you take neuroscience and what they know, evidence-based understandings from neuroscience, and then you take that and you apply it to humans. So, applied memory reconsolidation studies and how I apply what we understand from research to humans has been really effective with my clients, and it happens really fast. And that's why I always say this is all about learning to work with your brain, not against it. And when you understand
Yes.
how it actually works, not how society has taught us that it works or to think how it works, when you work with your brain, it changes really quickly. And our
Yes.
brain doesn't learn in fight, flight, freeze states. It learns in an approach state, really
Yes.
being curious and creative. Even confusion activates more of our prefrontal cortex so that we can
Yes.
learn more effectively. So if somebody has trauma and they don't have the ability to even be aware that they're in a fight, flight, freeze, they might just be walking away.
Yep.
If they don't have that awareness of what's happening in my body, it becomes very difficult to change the wiring in the brain. You can change it really
Yes.
quickly. Plus the history of um, the research, how the research was done, how people were treated with mental health disorders. So I don't even like the term mental health um, in general. So much about that has created this stigma that says, I'm not going to therapy. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going, no, there's nothing wrong with me. And so they don't do anything. And you can't change a neural network in your brain if you don't fire it. But does it need to be fired for 12 fucking sessions in tears? No, because what you just did is 12 fucking sessions in a fight, flight, freeze response.
Exactly.
So that, but that was the best we knew at the time. Right. So
Exactly.
we,
Yes.
if all we do is focus on evidence-based treatment programs that take years, we get stuck and maintain that system of stigma and fear that prevent people from getting the help they need, prevented me from getting the divorce that I needed to have.
Yes.
So that
Yes.
avoid state is not necessarily the most effective way of enhancing your life.
Yep.
It works the same in mental health treatments. Just because you think evidence-based treatments are the most effective, there's lots of research that says those treatments are not the most effective. So don't stop
Exactly.
at the gold standard. Keep, there's plenty of neuroscience research that didn't exist when those were put in place as the gold standard. So
Yes.
you have to keep working towards helping people.
Yes. One of the things I do when people come in their first session, they're like, I just want to learn some coping skills and go on with life. And I'm like, well, first of all, we have to get your brain and your central nervous system out of fight, flight, or freeze to be able to teach
Mhm.
you those coping skills. Because
Yeah.
I could teach you all the coping skills in the world, but state dependent learning, you're not going to know when to use them or
Yeah.
how to use them when you're in a heightened state of
Yeah.
arousal.
Yeah. Your brain's not picking out the flowers as you're running from the bear. And your brain
Exactly.
is doing the same exact thing when you're in fight, flight, freeze. It's not seeing the possibilities for helping yourself. It's just survival. Tunnel
Exactly.
vision.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Well, Mary, this was awesome.
I agree.
I started watching the new Alex Honnold documentary, and it's funny because he's with people. He's with a girl who's a climber too, and you hear her, like, "Oh God, oh no, oh God, I'm scared!"
Yeah.
Ah! And it's like
Yeah.
he's all like, cheering her on, and he's not saying anything about how scary it is.
Yeah.
They're on this Arctic crumbling ice. These
Yeah.
rocks that are just falling, and he's like, "Ah, we'll get up there."
Yeah.
And you hear
And
her. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
one guy dropped out
Yeah.
of that climb because he's
Yes.
like, nope, this is not worth it. This is not why
Yes.
I came on this trip. So
Yep. And Alex was like totally being the cheerleader for people. So it
yeah.
really comes down to, our brains are all very different.
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong. There's no good or bad. Things are
Yeah.
we are who we
Yeah.
are, regardless of how we present ourselves, how we
Yeah.
carry, how our brain develops, how our
Yeah.
brain operates.
Yeah. And
So
the thing
being
I
able,
loved about that too is how they talked to each other about it. They weren't shitty with Alex because he's like, it's fine. He wasn't shitty with them because they were dropping out or considering dropping out.
yes,
They were like, this is how I am. This is how I am. This is how I am. And they let each other be individuals. And
yes,
hey, if you drop out, that's okay. It doesn't have to be that you're a loser. This is where I'm at.
I respect you. This is
Yeah.
difficult. Yeah.
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 Relationships are better when you get to be yourself and set your
Exactly.
boundaries. But yes, absolutely. Accept influence from each other and challenge one another.
Yes.
And yeah, society's
Yeah.
better
So
that
many
way.
times, you look out in the workforce and you find people like Alex, right? You find the other people who are like the other guy who dropped out. And we're so like, oh God, do you know what him? Why is he so difficult? Why is she so difficult? All
Yeah.
we have to do is just meet people where they're at.
Yep.
No one's
Absolutely.
no one's faulty. No one's mentally, unable to do things. We all just operate very differently.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I know you have to leave early today, and that works for me. I'm going to get my grandbaby and spend the day with her.
Oh,
So
have fun with your grandbaby.
I will. So we'll see everybody next week. And just everybody remember, pay attention to where you feel things in your body because it's giving you information from prior experiences. And,
Yes.
it's telling you to avoid things that it could be perceived threats, not actual threats. And,
Yes.
let yourself have an interest in learning how to create an approach state that your brain goes, okay, that feels better than this avoid state. And you can change your brain very quickly. So
Yes.
don't avoid seeking help. You're not crazy. You're not broken. You're not fucked up. So
Yeah.
there's
Yep.
new cool information out there that can help you.
Yep. Be curious.
Yep,
So we'll see you guys next
absolutely.
week.
See you next week.
Bye, guys.